I now have the lovely job of introducing our speaker tonight. It's my very great pleasure to welcome up Alex Franks. Alex is a senior archaeologist with MOLA. He's a very skilled field archaeologist and also extremely knowledgeable in the ways of ancient woodwork. And I think we're going to hear about both of those things tonight. So Alex is going to come and talk to us about recent excavations of Holborn Viaduct and the unexpected discovery of the Roman funerary bed. Very exciting. So please, up you come, Alex.
So no need to introduce myself. Thanks, Helen. And thanks everyone for inviting me here today. So I'm a senior archaeologist and archaeological woodwork specialist at MOLA, and I'm going to be talking about our excavations at 14 to 21 Holborn Viaduct. I'll be focusing mainly on the Roman timber items that we found on site, including a number of well-preserved wooden coffins and what we're calling a funerary bed. So in many ways, it was typical, a large City of London site with our team dealing with complex, deep archaeology in the middle of a live construction site. The archaeological work started with an evaluation consisting of 11 trenches in 2022. Evidence of post-medieval remains as well as Roman deposits and disarticulated human remains were identified. A watching brief began at the start of 2023, followed by mitigation excavation in the summer of that year, and finishing last Thursday. So we're literally just coming off site. So as you can imagine, at this stage, we're just collating the data and beginning the analysis process. So any sort of conclusions I might be drawing, hopefully I'm not drawing too many wild conclusions. Yeah, sort of rein it in a little bit. So the site is located at the western side of the City of London, bounded by Holborn Viaduct to the north and Farringdon Street to the west. As many of you will already know, Farringdon Street lies over the now culverted River Fleet, which has its source in Hampstead and flows down into the Thames at Blackfriars, carving out a large valley in the underlying geology. Below the remains of 19th century warehouses, built when the viaduct was constructed in the 1860s, we found 18th century buildings, and these in turn were built over houses and commercial buildings such as the White Horse Inn and Rose Inn, constructed on the site after the devastation of the Great Fire of 1666. We found that before the Great Fire, most of the buildings fronted Turn Again Lane in the north part of the site, but in the southern part of the site, it was used as a cemetery. The land on the bank of the River Fleet being used as a burial ground was the result of the parish of St. Sepulchre's being buffeted by the waves of plague in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Before this, the site had been a fairly open space, but in the early 13th century, one of the medieval residents was a tanner, Philip de Haddon. Some of the chalk floors and masonry structures and timber-lined wells we have recorded may be part of this tannery. The typical cask-lined wells and tanning pits are of particular interest, as they not only provide an insight into the tanning industry, but can also shed light on medieval coopering practices, barrel making practices, as well as provide potential evidence of trade and commerce. Obviously, these casks started life containing things, and by analysing cooper's marks as well as merchant marks, we might discover what they contained initially or where they were from. Below the medieval layers, we found evidence of the first true Londoners. During the Roman period, an existing routeway was paved, and in later years became known as Watling Street. Holborn Viaduct and Newgate Street follow this route today. So that red circle, if anyone's guessing, is where the site is, outside of the city walls. This is a later image, well, an image of the later city of Roman London. Most of the Roman activity that I'm going to be talking about occurred in the early Roman period, so the 1st century, when the city would have been slightly different to that, a bit smaller, without the big impressive walls. The western boundary of the site abuts the eastern boundary of the River Fleet, and as a consequence, has preserved any buried wooden artifacts and structures in the anaerobic deposits by excluding oxygen, the microbes which degrade and break down wood are excluded, meaning that many of the timbers in the ground are almost as solid as the day they were covered. The steep banks of the Fleet Valley were laced with drainage channels, diverting water into the river. On the upper banks of the valley, we uncovered a particularly fine example of a Roman box well here on the left, constructed of sawn oak planks, cut to standardized dimensions, 2 cubits by 1 cubit. That's about 88 centimeters by 44 centimeters. These have been dovetailed together in the corners and recesses in opposite corners for small diagonal supports. You can just about see one there. So these may have acted to shore up the sides, although I suspect more practically they would have helped the person get in and out through it being well over head height, and also in use. It's not a nice thing to be stuck down well on. There are numerous, almost identical examples have been found of this type of well construction across Roman London. On the right, we can see a degraded base of a box drain set atop perpendicular saddle supports. Again, this construction was seen at the Bloomberg site and others. These typical examples of Roman woodworking were the exception on this site, and the other timbers we found have far fewer precedents. This feature was located at the lower levels of the river terrace and seemed to feed into another structure. A mysterious structure. As we excavated further south and west, we uncovered the steeply sloping banks of the Fleet cut into the underlying London clay. In the southwest corner of the site, we uncovered an alignment of vertical timbers. These proved to be at least 2 phases of pointed piles of various types, set at about 1.5 meters OD. Some small diameter, mostly between 15 and 10 centimeters, were piles, such as the one on the left there, were almost all of fast-grown oak, with between 20 and 25 growth rings. This suggests local coppicing practices, even more supported by the fact that the rings are quite far apart, suggesting that these trees were fast-growing, but also fairly straight as well. A significant proportion, and perhaps another phase, was made up of larger oak piles, cleft from very large straight-grained trees. And again, in marked contrast, this is the one I was talking about, a nice example. So much bigger and cleft from larger diameter trees, very, very slow-grown, straight-grained wood, suggestive of a wildwood source. If you can imagine lots of trees growing together, they're all trying to reach the light, grow tall and big. These timbers show none of the distinct Roman woodworking practices seen in the well, and are decidedly rustic, with no evidence from any of them of saw marks. the saw was introduced by the Romans and left a really clear mark on the wood culture in this country, and also happened to, when the Romans left, quote unquote, saws don't appear until the late 12th century. The last week I took samples of most of these timbers for scientific dating. C14 dating for the smaller round wood timbers, and luckily the majority of the larger cleft piles contained enough tree rings to use dendrochronology dating, although only a few had sapwood. It's worth noting as well that there's no signs of reuse amongst any of these timbers. The example on the right shows some really nice axe marks on the tip of one of these timbers. Most of the axe marks seem to be about 70 to 75 millimeters wide, which is, I've been told, fairly typical of the size of Roman axes. The purpose of the structure is unclear at this stage, and further stratigraphic analysis may help us to understand it. Initially, the possibility that it was a tide mill seemed reasonable, with a known example excavated further downstream of the Fleet Valley in the 1980s and early 1990s. However, this idea seemed less likely as we excavated the structure further. Due to the orientation of the structure, it was set at a sort of diagonal going down the slope, so not perpendicular or parallel to the Fleet, but offered a bit of a jaunty angle. It also lacks certain other features that you'd expect with a mill, including a mill pond, mill race, and also structural timbers, and of course millstones, which don't tend to move very far. It's so heavy. There was a pond, so where this pile of stones is, it's been interpreted as a shallow pond, which was potentially a natural feature, which was included as part of this structure, as yet unknown. Perhaps the structure was being used for corralling animals, providing access to the pond, with the rocks providing a safer access point. Maybe there was fishing activity going on, or maybe even there was some ritual significance. You can just about see a horse skeleton at the back there, and there was a number of these horse skeletons, most just the skull, but a few semi-articulated in and around this area of sort of swampy marginal land. Interestingly, this parallels the Upper Walbrook Cemetery, which again would have been very marshy, sort of liminal land, had the largest collection of horse skeletons recorded in London from the Roman period. And again, a burial ground landscape, which, without sort of giving the game away, we're in that. So we assume this to be Roman, from potsherds dating to the 1st century. But the structure itself looks decidedly un-Roman. It betrays none of the characteristic woodworking that we might expect, not least of all any saw marks, joints, anything like that. Hopefully the C14 and dendro dating gives a much clearer picture of what's going on. It's important to note that the spring high tide point during the 1st century is about 2 meters OD, which then fell off dramatically to 0 by 300 AD. It then rose back gradually up to 2 meters again by about 1100. So within the pond, we found these 2 small wooden objects. Just outside the structure, in the sort of swampy ponds deposits, maybe they'll shed light on the structure's purpose. Both are made of oak, They're fairly roughly carved. They again look fairly atypical for the Roman period. The one on the right has an in situ willow peg still in its freshly cut hole. It's really hard to see. I couldn't get a very good image of that before it went to conservation. But you might just about be able to make out a little black circle there. So there's a willow peg just here. There's also auger holes, one there, potentially also one there. So what was this used for? Answers on a postcard. We're very happy to hear anyone's suggestions. We've had suggestions that it might be an orlop cover. It looks to me like it could be part of furniture. The other one, a good suggestion was that it was potentially the rough out of a chest brace to be used in conjunction with a T-handled auger for drilling the holes for these. So you would have to have had one of those to make it. But yeah, any suggestions would be very appreciative. So this is an object we can be more certain of. So this spade was found within a circular pit containing Roman material from the Roman period. It's made of oak and was probably broken in use. The finely tapering blade suggests it may have had an iron shoe, like other examples that have been found, including at the Blueberg site. But no attachment marks are clear on the tip of the blade. So no real sort of evidence of degraded iron or nail holes, rivet holes. The handle and half of the blade are broken, and it seems to have been wedged halfway down this circular pit. Seemed to us at the time in frustration, having to dig out a lot of very, very wet clay, kind of knew what they were going through. But what was it used for? Well, one conceivable use could have been burial of the dead. The proximity to the fleet, as we have seen, has provided excellent conditions for preservation of organic material, especially wood. When we combine this with the site's location outside of Roman London and custom dictated burial only outside of the city limits above a certain age, leads to a very rare opportunity, the presence of wooden coffins. It's been difficult to put a solid number on how many well-preserved wooden coffins have been discovered from the Roman period, but it's safe to say they're very rare. A particularly fine example was discovered at Atlantic House, which is the other side of, virtually opposite the site. So it's the other side of Farringdon Street and just to the north of Holborn Viaduct. Others have been found in Southwark. And it's not always possible to tell whether the coffin has been purposefully made for the individual, or, as is more common with infant burials, the people are reusing furniture like a chest or a box to bury individuals in. Nevertheless, I think the final count at Holborn Viaduct is 7 coffins. All were buried at the lower levels of the river terrace, between 1.4 and 0.7 meters AD. Here we have 2 examples of infant coffins. The one on the left, this is after this, there was a skeleton. Just saying that. It's a very simple construction. It's a plank box which has been nailed together, and the one on the right seems to be constructed from thin slats, although it's heavily truncated and fairly difficult to tell. Another small coffin here was made from fairly thin planks of wood, nailed together with the addition of these vertical supports. So the side planks were about 5 millimeters thick, and now allowing for some level of compression of the timber. That's still a very, very thin board. The base, incidentally, was a lot thicker, so that's about 50 millimeters. You should just about be able to make out the half lap joints at the bottom of these vertical timbers, which held the coffin together with small square section iron nails. So at this point, I want to show the construction of the Atlantic house coffin, which I mentioned previously. The simple construction is of nailed together oak planks, not too dissimilar to the previous examples from Holborn. The use of sawn planks is typical in Roman London and makes the next examples more unusual. Three coffins were excavated, which are of a very unusual design. This example is the most heavily degraded, but we can make out that the base is not a solid plank of wood. Instead, it's comprised of thin laths of cleft wood, not dissimilar to materials seen in pale fences, such as the Bloomberg and the Liverpool Street Crossrail excavations. It's also got perpendicular cross patterns. This is for apart from the infant burials, all of the skeletons are of young people, the adult skeletons, so between 20 and 30, I think I'm right in saying. So this example survived far more intact, and it's possible to see how the base of the coffin was to some extent open to the elements. The base components were nailed to very thin cleft sideboards, which would have most likely not been strong enough to hold the weight of the deceased individual. This leads to a number of possibilities of burial practice. Perhaps the coffin was lowered into the grave using straps, which were then removed. Or perhaps the coffin was placed in the grave, both things, coffin and person, carried separately. The coffin was placed in the grave, then the deceased placed into the coffin, as well as other votive offerings. A nice example from this burial is this oil lamp, which interestingly was found within the grave cut but outside of the coffin itself, just to the side of the individual's head. The final example of a slatted based coffin was the most sturdy, and I've spent the start of this week cleaning and recording it. One thing to note is the high quality of the wood. This is made from very slow-grained, straight-grained oak heartwood, without one knot in the whole coffin. As with all the coffins which survived well enough to tell, none of the larger components are made from sawn planks, and are instead split or cleft from large diameter trees. So literally just halving a log, doing it to quarters, eighths, sixteenths, and so on. In fact, the head and footboards of this coffin are just over 40 centimetres wide and have no sapwood, so it must have come from a tree, maybe 1.5 metres wide. Interestingly, despite the high skill level needed to produce this raw material for these slatted beds, the construction techniques are fairly, for want of a better word, crude. Few joints, with the exception of the occasional lap joints, are used. Instead, the coffins are exclusively held together with very small iron nails. And I'm really interested to see how they could have held so much weight. Even the lids themselves were heavier than the thin bases. Oh yeah, and bottom left is an impression from the underside of the lid. So that's actually a lumbar vertebrae that's pressed itself into the wood of the lid. Yeah, it looks really happy with it. And another thing about this coffin, you might be able to make out that there's this is actually a ridge tile next to the head, buried inside the coffin, so the lid was covering that, removed, and then so that's definitely in situ. Interestingly, I got told today that it looks like there might be the residue of some food on there. So potentially using a very strange style of plate. Even though I'm here to talk about the woodwork site, I should probably briefly mention some of the other burials, which have included 8 cremations and a rather nice cremation pit on the right here. Some of the grave goods associated with burials were fairly spectacular, including this necklace. This group of beads, pendants, and other jewellery found in a rich late Roman grave. Skeletal analysis has not yet taken place, but we suspect that this will prove to be a female child or adolescent. Our conservators are currently documenting and disentangling this group of beads, reporting how it was strung together and placed to the ground. It's fairly unusual to have a string of beads that has remained intact, so you can actually tell the sort of order that they go in. Often they'll split all over the place, and we lose that information. The presence of gold and silver is a good indicator of the wealth of the person or their family. Other luxury materials present in the group, such as jet and amber, are believed to have magical and protective properties by the Romans. The lump projecting from the gold pendant might be part of a tooth or tusk. Other objects might also have proved to be amulets or perhaps figurines. So this is a symbol of wealth and status, perhaps for the afterlife, but is arguably also of magical and symbolic importance. Placing them in the grave was a way that mourners could continue to express care and love for the deceased, and perhaps also offer them some protection in the afterlife. This is a collection of objects found inside one of the funerary urns. The objects provide a fascinating insight into the burial itself. We can tell that the objects were placed on the funerary pyre with the deceased. This unassuming droplet of glass here. This unassuming droplet of glass tells us of glass objects which were consumed in the flames. These 2 melon beads do not represent a full string, so might also be the remnants of an object that was mostly destroyed on the pyre, or perhaps a token offering from a mourner. The unburnt lamp was placed into the urn upside down and was clearly no longer lit at the time of burial. Perhaps it was used to illuminate an earlier stage of the funerary rituals, or it might have been intended for use in the afterlife. The glass vessel was unburned, and so it too was added after the fire. It has no trace of a stopper and a broken rim, perhaps suggesting it was opened and its contents used at some stage during the funerary rituals. I think this photo is a brilliant illustration of a waterlogged, deeply stratified London site. In the foreground, we see a medieval cask lined well, similar to the, well, probably part of the tanning area that we established. And it's got a modern concrete pile straight through the centre. Remarkable that it didn't, it just completely missed it, went straight through the middle. The long timber is actually a hollow elm log, which has been rather finely faceted on the exterior. So it's a water pipe, and the fact that it's so finely worked on the outside leads us to suggest that it may well be reused. We found on waterfront sites reused ship pumps, which have been repurposed as water pipes. Often the elm, sort of fairly ubiquitous post-medieval elm water pipes are not as finely worked on the outside. Some of them are just still tree trunks. Within the alluvial deposits of the burial ground, we uncovered what we thought, right at the back, was a lid of a further coffin. At this point in the excavation, finding a coffin had ceased to be a huge surprise. However, the site did have one fair surprise. As we excavated further, we found a rather confusing collection of finely worked and jointed timbers directly overlying the skeleton of a young male at about 1.5 meters OD, and lying literally centimeters below that hand pipe. Obviously, it's also truncated by concrete piles, but you can't have everything. As we carefully recorded and removed these timbers, it became clear that they had been stacked with some level of care over the deceased. Better illustration. So you can see that they've been stacked up on the right there and stacked directly over them. As we examined the timbers, and after a lot of head scratching, it became clear that this was a single piece of furniture, and more specifically a bed. At this stage, I want to clarify that the Roman term lectus is used to mean bed and couch interchangeably. And here goes my really terrible Latin. So a lectus cubicularis for sleeping, a lectus tricliniaris for dining, and a lectus funeralis for funerary rites. As this collection of timbers was located very firmly within the burial ground, some of the coffins were just meters away, the same level, directly associated with the skeleton, led us to the decision to call it a funerary bed. But it may well have started life as a piece of practical domestic furniture. This is one of the legs and side rails after we've removed a load of the other timbers and also the skeleton. Here's an initial reconstruction of the bed based on the components that remained. Highlighted are the components we have, so I hope you'll agree that there isn't too much conjecture as to its design. And it's roughly, we have about 3/4 of the timbers we have. All of the components of the bed are made from, again, very straight-grained, slow-grown oak heartwood, perhaps from the same source as the coffins. Although I suspect it wasn't made by the Holborn coffin maker or makers, as the level of skill and precision evident in this bed is extremely high. The bed itself measures almost exactly 2 meters long by 1 meter wide by about 50 centimeters tall. The components present include 4 slats with nearly rectangular cross sections, but chamfered, with the edges tapering to make tenons, which corresponded exactly with blind mortices in the 2 side rails. By blind mortices, we mean that tenons don't go all the way through the mortise, but stop within the rail itself. The rails are of differing widths. So you can see that the back rail is much wider than the more decorative front rail. Although, unfortunately, it was very damaged by the modern concrete sea-cap pile line. The asymmetric nature of the bed is in keeping with other Roman beds or couches, which are designed to stand against the wall. Interestingly, the tops of the two legs we have a recessed joint of unknown function. Go back again. So the tops of the legs here, so these little recesses. So no attachments were found for these, no peg holes, no nail holes. So we can't rule out the idea that there might have been a canopy over this bed, as many depictions of funerary beds have a sort of A-frame structure over the top, like a little roof. There was also a small handful of timbers which didn't fit into this bed. Firstly, a neat stack of very thin cleft material, similar to the pale fence material, or the laths at the bottom of the coffins. You can see it on the bottom left here. These are very thin slats of wood. They have no sorts of joints, peg holes, nothing like that. So fairly difficult to try and, you know, join them up. There are also 4 small rectangular sections which have been decorated, very similar to the side rails. You can see these little bits here. So we have 4 of these, and they've got the same decoration as the side rails, but they don't. They're sawn quite neatly, but they're of differing widths and thicknesses. So it doesn't seem like they've deliberately dismantled the bed by sawing it into pieces. More like these are almost test examples. They've got decorative moulding, which I'll talk about later, and they were fairly weathered. But their purpose seems a mystery. In London, we're lucky to have an extensive corpus of Roman woodworking. However, joinery from this period is comparatively rare. And by joinery, I mean medium-scale fine woodworking, such as furniture, as opposed to large-scale structural carpentry for buildings or waterfront sites, such as revetments. And separate again from the crafts of cooperage, barrel making, or even the production of domestic items, spoons, cups, bowls, and other trim. You can see part of a particularly fine example of Roman joinery from the Bloomberg site on the bottom left. This is part of a 1st century wooden door. On the right was a fresco from Pompeii depicting a carpenter sat at a low bench, which there's numerous frescoes of, cutting what looks to be a mortise with a large chisel and a hammer. Cleaving or splitting wood, first in half, then quarters and eighths, and so on, was widely practiced in London during the Roman period. But the specific project. So thin fence pails are recorded from Bloomberg and Liverpool Crossrail, as I mentioned. Thin bucket staves from Gresham Street, roof shingles from the Courage Brewery site, and writing tablets from Bloomberg and others are all made from cleft wood. In order to split fine boards, a specialist cleaving tool called a froe is employed. This is essentially a long blade, fairly blunt, set at right angles to a wooden handle, which is held in a clamp or cleaving brake, essentially a vice, which allows leverage used to split the wood along its radial face. This is an example of an illustration of a froe from the Salmo Museum. So the other method of producing boards during the Roman period was with a large frame saw. Trees were hewn with axes into square section bolts and then anchored on a trestle, so-called seesawing, and sawn down the length. This is how the planks of the boxwell we saw earlier produced, and it's a really nice indicator of Roman woodworking to get a sawn face on a plank and on the other side have the hewn surface, and it's evidence of this technique. The plane is an essential tool in the creation of fine furniture, creating flat surfaces from which joints and decoration can be added. By the fine nature of the bed, we can assume that after the components were cleft into planks, they would have been hewn flat with axes and finally planed to their finished dimensions. Sadly, the accomplished craftsperson would leave little trace that they had done their job well in terms of tool marks. Here are some examples of smoothing planes from the Roman fort of Belsum in the Netherlands and from the Yorkshire Wolds. They're of a remarkably similar design, but the top two have bodies of maple wood, and the bottom one is a bit more high status, being made out of ivory with an iron sole. We can also infer the use of perhaps a curved sole plane or spoke shave, from the finely tapering leg, which is mortised to receive the pegged tenons of the side rail and end boards with really tiny little wooden pegs. Moulding plans. So there is clear evidence of decorative moulding on side rails, feet, and end boards, and it's a real rarity to find this detail surviving on Roman timber. This decoration is applied with a tool similar to the previous planes, but with a cutting blade contoured to a particular design. A selection of plane irons displayed here from London, with a moulding plane in the centre. You just about see the pattern, the curved pattern on the lower end of it. Roman funerals are extensively depicted on grave markers, such as this example from Amitera in Italy, dating to the 1st century BC. It depicts the deceased lying lifelike atop a funerary bed, being carried on a bier surrounded by musicians and mourners. The illustration to the right is taken from the Eastern Cemetery of Roman London publication, and it nicely mirrors our side, with a grave digger and a wooden spade and a coffin in the ground, although ours are all of wood, not lead like this one. There's even a funerary bed being carried aloft in the background, and you might just be able to make out on both of these images the elaborate decorative legs. This type of furniture leg is composed of a square section iron bar, onto which elaborately turned wood or ivory sections are slotted like beads on a string. This example comes from the Roman fort at Vindonissa in Switzerland. Two similar iron rods were discovered in Colchester in the late 19th century, and assumed to be the same manufacture process of furniture. The carbonised bed or couch from Herculaneum is somewhat similar to the Holborn bed, although obviously not the legs again. Perhaps the two best parallels are both from London. On the left is a side rail of a possible bed from the Liverpool Street Crossrail excavation. There are obvious similarities with the mortises for the slats. Interestingly, this timber was reused as a ha-hung door component. On the right is a single component from the Draper's Garden site, which is interpreted as an end board with pegged tenons, which are both are made from oak heartwood and show real similarities with the Holborn bed, which isn't seen in other continental Roman examples, and perhaps leads us to the idea that this was a local design. So what's next for the timber? Well, the bed has been sent for preservation to the Mary Rose Trust, and will be subject to further study, I'm sure, after it's been freeze-dried and impregnated with peg, so it's been preserved. The final coffin is currently being cleaned and recorded, and is already proving to be extremely interesting. And we're currently finalising the initial samples to be sent for dendrochronology and C14 analysis, including some of the pointed piles and boxwell, some of the pointed piles and part of the boxwell. The funerary bed, as well as the coffins, provide a rare insight into Romano-British funerary practice at the edge of the city. The analysis has just begun, and I'm sure there'll be even more to unravel in the following months and years. I just want to thank the on-site team who did such a great job in sometimes and more often than not extremely challenging conditions. Sites like these, completely waterlogged sites, produce some of the most amazing archaeology that London produces, but they're also some of the worst to work on. Thanks very much.
That was so stunning. Thank you so much. If you're happy to answer questions, then we can field with you. I'm sure there's loads. I can see that there's
Yes, it's a question about your horses in your state animals.
Yes.
Yes.
So
were they in individual pits or were they being thrown into?
no, it seemed like the whole area was just covered in fairly irregular alluvial deposits, and so some of the horses seemed to be just, yeah, one of them in fact was actually wrapped around one of the timbers, so it had clearly been sort of washed and moved about the place, but yeah, none of them seem to have been deliberately deposited. They seem fairly irregular.
I'm just thinking about tanning, but
It's a bit of a mystery.
Any more questions out there? I've got one if it's not cheeky. I was wondering if you're talking about the lack of saw marks on some of the wood. And I was wondering how the makers of coffins would fit into like that woodworking, like with all these different specialisms.
Yeah.
Like, would it be a specialist skill? Of
Yeah, well,
that
that's
it
a
would
really
be
good
your-
question.
like your
So on the one hand, it seems like there's a real similarity, at least three of these lath coffins. But again, as what I mentioned about the sort of crude nature of it, it may well have been people sort of creating them ad hoc, or one person creating all of them, or there may well have been someone who was doing it in a more specialised way.
and we were looking at joiners who make profits as well as village.
Yeah, I mean, it may well be, yeah. But again, yeah, so little evidence exists of both of those things that it's hard to sort of draw those similarities. I mean, it's conceivable that, you know, a joiner was making those coffins. It just seems to me a bit unlikely due to the fact that there's no joinery in it. There's no sort of dovetails or mortises or things like that. It's all fairly just piece of plank wood, other plank wood, nailed in, like that.
Hey,
There are perhaps some parallels then. This board that we might call sort of standard Roman fence panels is used for all kinds of things. The only other coffins that there are in London we didn't mention are baby coffins from Draper's Gardens, which are made with the same board, and it's standard material. So it's a bit like matchboarding today, or it's a universal material. River vases in the Netherlands made of the same boards. It's kind of a standardized product that they use for all kinds of things. So some of the strong boxes for the floors on some of the board equivalents are made of the same board. It's like, I think you might have a picture of timber yards around the city where some of the more standardized products can be bought, and that board is one of the standardized products we own made. I mean, people earlier and later produced boards in similar ways, but they weren't so standard. That's really good point.
any further questions, Alex? It's one on you too. Oh, is there one too? Something in the chat.
Farms. Ship or dock?
Oh yeah, so the question is, so ship or dock, rope handling equipment in terms of finds. So yeah, we didn't find anything like that. I mean, the only things that conceivably might be associated with rope blocks are those two wooden objects with the holes, which have similarities with rope blocks, but yeah, nothing discernibly maritime. We did really look for it as well. Yeah, we like the idea of finding both stuff. Yeah.
And somebody else had asked us, have you found any interesting or uncommon plant remains or seeds?
Well, yeah, so that's something that we'll be finding out in the coming months. So analysis has just started on the environmental samples we've taken. We had some really good geoarchaeological components to this site as well. So we've got a really great sequence from the top of the terrace all the way down to the lowest site as well.
Anyone else? I think we should thank Alex again. There was so many questions.